Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another video on History by Podcast. Today I'm joined by Professor Nicholas Peter Lee Allen. And today we're going to be talking about how Jesus compares to Greco-Roman deities. So thank you for joining me today, Nicholas.
Yeah, it's a pleasure, Jacob.
Yeah, so I just want to start us off with, Christian apologists will often say Jesus is a lot more original than you think he is. He doesn't really resemble these other Greco-Roman deities. They may have some superficial similarities, but Jesus has no connection to them at all. And how would you respond to that?
Yes, well, if you're looking for a specific duplicate of I'm going to use the word Jesus myth because the Jesus that is worshipped is not identical with the presumed historical Jesus. That's the first thing we have to be very clear about. So we don't know if the real historical Jesus actually lived or not. I'm not saying he didn't, but we don't have any information either for or against that fact. But if we assume he did live, I think you'll find that he bears very little resemblance to the Jesus of myth, which is the Jesus of faith. Believers will accept that the Gospels give an accurate account of an historical man, but unfortunately, the texts are fabulous and contradictory. So, if there is any factual information in the Gospels, and I'm sure there is, it's not enough to give us a clear picture of the historical person. So on that level already we have a problem. So to try and say, well, was there another person like Jesus before Jesus? No, obviously not. But I think we have to be careful not to conflate information and realize that religious beliefs and certain ideas and eschatologies go back thousands of years. And religions borrow from each other. They recast deities in different forms. They change names. Certain powers of certain deities get swapped around. And if you take the mythological Jesus, or the Jesus of faith, rather, let's call him a Jesus of faith, he has many attributes which can be traced back many thousands of years before his supposed existence. And that, what I'm saying is, it's not the Christian, the Jesus of faith is unique in terms of his totality, but in terms of the parts that make up that totality, there's nothing original whatsoever, if that makes sense. I think that's a fairer way of putting it. Certainly, Christianity is not a unique religion in terms of its belief structure and the tenets of its religion. You can find aspects in other religions. I don't know how far back you want me to go on that. I mean, but if I can start with Zoroastrianism as a start, if you'd like me to do that.
Yeah, yeah, go
Um,
ahead.
okay. What can we say about Zoroastrianism? Just a little bit of background for people who don't know what Zoroastrianism is. It's a religion that goes back probably at least to about 1500 BCE, maybe even older. But we know the ancient Iranians or the Persians had polytheistic belief systems. They had many deities, many gods. And through the actions of their prophet, again, acclaimed prophet, we don't know if he actually lived, in his home language, he'd be called Zarathustra, but we know him better as Zoroaster in English. And according to the stories, he had a divine revelation where the one true God came to him and told him that the worship of many gods was incorrect. And from that time onwards, Zoroastrians believe that they have been worshipping the one true deity. His name is Ahura Mazda, which translates as wise Lord, and he in many ways resembles the deity of Judeo-Christian and Islamic people in many ways. That he started off as a national god, that's true, but he's now a international deity, if you like. He's a universal deity. This deity had an evil nemesis, an arch nemesis, who had slightly less power than him. If you want to use Judeo-Christian terms, he was the Satan. His name is Angramanyu. He's the purveyor of the lie. And Zoroastrians believe that Ahura Mazda wants everybody to work with him towards establishing a place of harmony and goodness and holiness and rightness, a term they called Asha, which is like a form of divine truth and harmony and well-being. And Angramanyu's job is to unpick that and destroy everything that's been built. And the bottom line is that you can either choose to side with the agency of good or the agency of evil. And at the end of times, there will be a last judgment and we'll all be judged. And those who are on the side of the moral will have eternal life and the others will be destroyed. And that's pretty much a setting that Christianity would feel quite comfortable being placed within. Some of the ideas that come out of Zoroastrianism, which definitely influence Christianity, and they're not the only influences on Christianity, but the first is divine judgment, the idea that people are going to be judged at the end of time and held accountable for what they've done. The existence of hell is a Zoroastrian concept, and interestingly enough, it's a place of fire. I can talk a little bit about that. What's rather interesting is that at the end of time, both the morally upright and the unrighteous will be bathed in rivers of molten metal or fire, and the evil ones will be destroyed. But the good people, the moral people, will feel the fire as a warm milk bathing their bodies. That is quite a nice allegory. The Zoroastrians believe in salvation, which their concept of salvation existed thousands of years before the Christian notion of salvation. They also have messianism. They have a messianic concept. They believe, for example, that Zoroaster, that his sperm is stored on earth under a sacred lake. And there are different versions of the story, but a virgin will fall pregnant with the sperm and give rise to a savior who will be the descendant of Zoroaster. And as I say, there are different versions of the story. One even involves 3 saviors, each reigning for 1,000 years before the end of time. And each one requires a virgin woman to give birth to him. Of course, if we're going to talk about virgin births, that's also a very old concept. I'm just thinking on top of my head, Alexander the Great, for example, was believed to have been born from his mother having been impregnated by Zeus. All right, his mother wasn't a virgin, but the deity was his father, was responsible for bringing him into the world. And with Zoroastrianism, Ahura Mazda is responsible for bringing into the world an incarnate version of himself through the vehicle of a virgin woman. So these ideas are ancient, they're not new. Another thing that comes from Zoroastrianism, as one example, is the belief that corpses can resurrect. The idea that at the end of time, when you enter into paradise, and by the way, the paradise is a Persian term. The very word paradise that we still use today actually is a Persian word. They believe that you would need a physical body to enjoy the afterlife. So what would happen is at the end of time, after the judgment, you would be given an indestructible body, which is a resurrection. As I said, they believe in the end of days. They believe in a kingdom of God. And if you think of the the Christian message is that Jesus came to preach the end times and the coming of the kingdom of God. It's very, very similar belief system. If we jump from Zoroastrianism to other major influences on modern Christianity, we could look at Egypt. Egypt gives us many, many interesting, what's the word I'm looking for, motifs that have been borrowed or reworked or refashioned over time and have been incorporated into the eschatology of the new religion. Jacob, do you want me to stop here, or do you want me to carry on talking about Egypt?
Carry on.
Okay. So, for example, many people believe that baptism is something unique to Christianity. And as some others will also tell you, well, that's not so, because Jews also baptize in the sense that they have a mikvah and they use water to mark the ends of a period of uncleanliness, a spiritual uncleanliness. But not only Judaism has this practice of baptism, it goes back even further than that. The Egyptians had baptism. It's believed the Minoans had a form of water purification. They found the equivalent of a mikvah in many of the so-called palace complexes on Crete. The Zoroastrians have a baptism. The Babylonians have baptism. For example, the Egyptians would baptize their priests and kings to purify them before they took up office. It's a symbol of ritual purification, also for the Greeks and the Romans, and its usage was common and widespread. I'll give you an example. Herodotus, the Greek historian, who lived about the 4th century, 3rd century BCE, he tells us when an Egyptian touched a pig, he would baptize himself in the river fully clothed. And here baptism referred to submerging or dipping one's body into a large volume of water. And for that you need the sea, a river, or a lake. And there are many examples of devotees from various faiths having water poured over their head or being sprinkled with water before entering a temple. And sometimes that ritual ends with another sprinkling with oil or anointing with oil. And there are loads and loads of examples I can cite. There's a temple of Athena at Pergamum, which is that's the 2nd century, middle of the 2nd century BCE. There's a Castalian spring at Delphi in the 1st century BCE. The Asclepios sanctuary at Pergamon, which is the 2nd century of the Common Era. The Acropolis at Lindos, 2nd century, and the sanctuary at Men Tyrannos at Sunion. Another feature that predates the Council of Nicaea's declaration that there was a Trinity, that the Godhead is tripartite. We spoke about this in earlier talks about the hypostases, the Father, the Spirit, and the Son being unified and being one personality, but with 3 bodies. That Trinity, that concept of a Trinity, is very, very old. The Egyptians, I think most people know that the Egyptians had trinities, the most famous one being probably Osiris, Isis, and Horus. And there are many sculptures, for example, that you can see showing the mother Isis holding her baby Horus in her lap, just like a mother and child. Very similar to the Virgin Mary holding the infant Christ. Very similar concepts. Other trinities, which are well known and often involved the king, because the king was seen as the father of the nation. So King Menkaure, who was from the 4th dynasty, he had a trinity with Hathor, and we have another one with Khonsu, Mut, and Amun. The creator god Ptah had a trinity with King Ramses the Great and Sekhmet, when Sekhmet was still considered a good guy before he became the epitome of evil. Nefertim had a trinity with Ptah and Sekhmet. There was also a trinity with Re, which is the creator god at noon and his highest point in the sky, and Asat, or better known as Isis in Greek, and Anubis or Anpu. That's the deity that looks like a jackal. They were also a trinity. Another thing that the Egyptians were very into was resurrection cults. Again, I think the best known one is probably the Osiris cult, and what I'm saying here is just repeating myself, but I'm sure most people know about it. We know that Osiris, as a deity, has been around a long time. There's mention of him in the 5th dynasty from the pyramids of Unas. I don't know how many of your viewers know about the pyramid of Unas. It looks like a pile of rubble today, but underneath the ground are perfectly intact burial chambers, and the walls are covered in hieroglyphs. There's so much information in this pyramid. It tells us about their beliefs of the afterlife at that time. And here I'm talking about 2465 BCE. That's a long time ago. And in there are descriptions of Osiris. So he probably goes back even further than that, to pre-dynastic times. And the basic story, again, many versions, and we can thank Greek authors like Plutarch for conveying this information to us. The story goes that Osiris fell out with his evil twin brother, Sekhet, and he was chopped up into pieces. Depending on the story that you read, the number varies, but it's at least 14 bits and pieces, which were scattered over the whole of Egypt. And Osiris's sister and wife, Isis, travels over Egypt and picks up all the little bits and pieces, and she reassembles him and makes the world's first mummy. This mummy had no phallus, so she had to create a phallus for it. And in one version, it's made out of gold, which is the flesh of the gods. She copulates with the mummy, and she brings forth Horus, who becomes the intercessor. And through his death and resurrection, he becomes the god of the afterlife, and he promises eternal life for those who believe in him. So we've had this discussion before. If a deity got a cold and got pneumonia and died, that's not very awe-inspiring. But if a god gets really hammered at death, crucified or chopped up into little pieces and is restored, that sends the message that he's really powerful, that he can overcome the most incredible threat to his life, that he has this enormous power for resurrection and everlasting life. And if you, as a mortal, believe in him, it's going to be really easy to fix your problems, if that makes sense. And as I say, his son becomes the intercessor. Without getting too involved with Egyptian theology, they believed in the existence of a bar and a car, which is a kind of a soul. One is more your personality, and the other one's more your motor function, if you like. And Horus becomes the car for Osiris, and he's able to travel from this world to the afterworld, or the afterlife, the field of reeds. So he's doing the psychopompous act that you're going to also find with the Greeks, where the deity is allowed to travel from this world down into the underworld, which is something that Jesus is supposed to have done as well when he went into Hades and freed the souls of everybody after his crucifixion. So you can see these ideas are old, very, very old. So Osiris is considered the god the father, and if you like, by his resurrection and reanimation, he's defeated death, just like Jesus did. Now, the Osiris myth continues with the advent of the Ptolemaic dynasty in ancient Egypt. As you know well, when Alexander the Great died in the 4th century BCE, he was replaced by 4 generals, and those 4 generals, to give you the simple version of the story, chopped up his empire into 4 pieces, more or less 4 or 5 pieces. And one of the biggest sections of that empire was Egypt, and it was taken over by the Ptolemies. Now, the Ptolemies were Greek, and they considered themselves superior to the indigenous population. And Greeks started to move into Egypt. Alexandria, one of the cities founded by Alexander the Great, grew in size and importance. It became a major center of the ancient world. It was a center of learning and culture, and it was populated by Greek-speaking people. There was also a Jewish diaspora there, and we know that in order to try to have the indigenous population of Egypt buy in, as it were, to having a foreign king, they came up with the synthetic deity called Serapis. And Serapis is an amalgamation of deities. He's actually a manufactured god. All right, he's got a little bit of Osiris in him. He's how can I put this? He's got Zeus in him. He's got Asclepius, the god of healing. He's a savior deity. He's a sun deity. He's got bits of Helios in him. He's a mishmash of deities. And he was then foisted onto the population. The Greeks accepted him because he looks human, anthropomorphic. But the Egyptians tended to dismiss him because he didn't look like one of their deities. As you know, most of their deities tend to have the heads of animals superimposed on a human body. So he didn't catch on there, but he certainly caught on through the rest of the Roman and Greek world at that time. And they gave him Isis as his wife. So Isis, who had been previously the wife of Osiris, now becomes the wife of Serapis. And he is a god of resurrection. And eventually, through popularity, Isis gained her own following in the Roman world. She became the goddess of the cosmos. And what is interesting here is that from the 4th century BCE onwards, increasingly these deities, especially Isis, started to have what are called aretologies produced. An aretology is basically like a gospel. The Christian gospel is in fact an aretology. The deity has a proclamation made about their powers. And although the Christians of the 4th century of the Common Era started to destroy books and texts belonging to non-Christian religions, many of Isis aretologies have survived because they were carved in stone on pillars, for example, and columns of temples. So those bits of stone that have remained still carry this information. And I'm going to read you a bit from one of her aretologies, just so you can get the gist of it. This one is from Andros, probably the 2nd or 1st century BCE. And Isis says to her faithful, I am the ruler of the land with Hermes. Now, Hermes, we can talk about Hermes just now. Hermes is another precursor of Jesus. She says, I invented letters, I gave laws to mankind, I discovered crops for mankind, I separated earth from heaven, I directed the orbit of the stars, I devised the journey of the sun and moon, I brought woman and man together, I imposed on woman to bring forth the baby in the 10th month. And she goes on and on and on. And then she says, I'm the mistress of rivers and winds and sea. Nobody is glorified without my consent. I am mistress of thunder. I rouse and decide. That is also fulfilled. I free those in chains. I conquer fate. To me, fate obeys. And just for comparison, let's read the Eratology for Jesus. If I go to the Gospel of John, we hear, I am the anointed one, I am the bread of life, I am the truth, I am from above, hold to my teachings, you'll know the truth, I am sent by God, I am God, I am the light of the world, I am the good shepherd, I am the Son of God, I am the resurrection and the life, I am the way. Similar sentiments. It is an Eratology of the deity. Do you want me to stop there or go on to the Greeks?
You can go on.
Okay, you must just ask me questions if you want. Now, I mentioned psychopomps before. Very briefly, if you look at the Greek deities, we know they're very anthropomorphic. They're basically human beings who are stronger than us. The Greek gods are not infinitely powerful. They can be, in fact, they can be injured. If you read the Odyssey, the gods get wounded. They're very powerful, though, but they're just not infinitely powerful. And the Olympian gods, Zeus and Hera and Hermes, are the gods of light. They stay above mankind on Mount Olympus. They are the gods of reason and sanity, if you like. But they also have sonic gods, in other words, underworld deities like Dionysus and Hades and Persephone. These are the deities of the dark side, the gods of death, the irrational side of life, the mystery, the mystics, etc. And Hermes is the only deity in the Greek system who can flutter between the two worlds. He can be on Olympus and shoot right down to Hades whenever he likes. He's the only god that can do that. So he has this, what we call it, psychopomp. He's a psychopomp. Exactly like Horus was with his father, Osiris. He has a lot of powers. He's the god of music, the wind. He's also the god of thieves, travelers, etc. And like Jesus, he watches over his flocks. So that concept of a caretaker who looks after his people like their sheep starts a long time ago. And he's often portrayed in art carrying a lamb or a ram on his shoulders. And if there is time, I can show you some very nice artworks a little bit later. I'll take you quickly through 1,000 years of artwork so you can see how that developed and evolved from 6th century BCE right up to the beginnings of Christianity.
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay. Hermes is often shown, well, he's shown in many guises depending on the period, but he's very famously shown as a bearded man, normally on a, what would you call it? Well, it's called a Hermes, but it's a pylon. It's a square-edged pillar with his head mounted, and it has a phallus, and that is placed at the crossroads because he's the patron deity of traveling. But he's also portrayed as a clean-shaven individual with curly hair. Often he wears a it's called a petassos. It looks a little bit like a British Tommy going into World War I, but it's got wings on it to show that he can fly. And he has what in Greek is called talaria. That's his sandals. They've got little wings on to show that he can fly around. He's got this power. And he also holds in his hand the caduceus, which most of you have seen before. It's normally used now on medical signage, for example, on hospitals, the two snakes curling around a stick or a pole. That is actually Hermes' symbol, and we're still using it today for medicine. Okay. Okay, so he has all these special powers. He's able to travel between the world of reason and the world of irrationality. He's able to do powerful things even for the deities. There are many stories about things that he's done for them. Like, for example, I think he saved Zeus once in a battle against a giant called Typhon. And he helped rescue Odysseus from bewitchment. He's considered a caring protector and a shepherd. And I think when I show you the pictures, I'll talk more about that again. Now, there were festivals in ancient times where Hermes would walk around a city holding a lamb or a ram above his head, on his shoulders. And Hermes also assisted the god of the underworld, Hades, by bearing down souls of the dead. So he carries the souls there. And he's an intercessor between the two worlds. Okay. Many people recognize that Christianity in its earlier stages was a form of mystery religion. That has been challenged by some people, but there's certainly aspects of early Christianity that are very similar to the Mysteria or the mystery religions. The idea, for example, the Eleusinian mysteries, which are based on the belief that the daughter of Demeter is the goddess of fertility. Her daughter Persephone was kidnapped by Hades and taken down to hell, basically, Hades. And because of that, she went into mourning and everything started to die. And so there was a meeting of minds, and it was decided that Persephone could spend some months above the ground. And that's when Demeter is happy and she allows things to grow. That's the summer and the spring. And then when she goes back to her husband, Hades, then we have autumn and winter. And this was the theme for a mystery religion, which goes way back to the beginnings of the Bronze Age. It's really ancient. And people all over Greece who knew about it wanted to be part of it. And another thing that's very interesting to realize is that in Greek and also Roman society, you had your civic religions, your state religions, which everybody had to conform to because it was, if you like, a way of showing loyalty to your nation. But they also had their private beliefs. And this mystery religion was very, very popular. And the only requirement was that you could speak Greek and that you didn't have blood on your hands. But to become part of this, you had to go through initiation. And sometimes these people would wear special clothing, they'd have special handshakes, they'd have special diets. A lot of these sects were, for example, vegetarian and not eat meat. The Pythagoreans were the same. They only ate vegetables. They wouldn't eat meat. It was a way of distinguishing yourself from other people. And the early Christians were the same. They would meet privately in people's homes. They probably had their own handshake, and they probably had their own secret signs, if you like, to make sure that the person wasn't infiltrating, under suspect circumstances. They also had very strict rules that you were not allowed to divulge what had taken place in the initiation. The one claim was that you could even be killed with the Eleusinian mysteries. But we know, for example, with the mysteries of Mithras, which was a male-orientated belief system, it was very popular with the soldiers, but they allowed people of all walks of life, rich and poor, free man and slave, to be a member of that. And although they did indeed have secret meetings under the ground in the Mithraeum, they would also allow meetings above ground in the basilicas. So it wasn't that secret in that sense. It was really more a closed circle. They weren't frightened of showing themselves to the public. I think we should also mention very quickly Orpheus. Orpheus is a normal mortal being who had this gift of playing music. It was so powerful that he was able to control the animals with it. A little bit like St. Francis of Assisi before his time, if that makes sense. So the story goes that his wife, she dies, depending on the story. There are many versions how she dies, and she goes down to Hades. And Orpheus uses his music to get into Hades and speak directly with Hades and Persephone. And in that guise, Persephone is now the queen of death, and Hades is the king of death. And he manages to convince them that he can take his wife up from hell back into the light. Now, this is the only time in Greek writing that a human, a mere mortal, has had this power, because this is something that Hermes can do at will. And the deal was that Orpheus had to return to the land of the living, and his wife would follow him, and he was not to look back. And he walks back up to the land of the living, and just as he comes into the light, he doesn't hear her following him, and he turns back to see if she's following him, and he sees her, and because he's turned back, she's whisked back down into hell, and he doesn't get his wife back. And later the story goes that he was attacked by Maenads, and he was chopped up in little bits, and only his head remained, which continued to prophesy. Now, what is interesting is Orpheus, as a symbol of the power of the deity to appease the, if you like, the wild emotions of these wild animals and keep them peaceful, was associated with Jesus later. So Orpheus is used as a symbol, and Hermes is used as a symbol for many religions, not just Christianity. But a lot of the polytheistic religions that coexisted at that time used the symbol of Hermes, or the symbol of, or the iconography rather, of Hermes as psychopomp and Orpheus as psychopomp on their walls and their catacombs, and the Christians did as well. Orpheus becomes a symbol or an icon for Jesus, as Hermes also becomes an icon for Jesus, which tells us that the religions at that time were cross-pollinating, that the same symbol could be used by multiple religions. That's very important. For example, in some of the catacombs, we see depictions of Heracles, we see depictions of Moses, we see depictions of Orpheus and Hermes, and we see repeat symbols of, for example, a peacock, which is a symbol of the afterlife. And you'll find a Jewish tomb and a Christian tomb and a polytheist tomb with very similar iconography on the wall. So it's a sharing almost of ideas. And I will show you just now with some pictures that Orpheus appears on many Christian tombs in the early centuries of the belief. So maybe I should end with Dionysus. Dionysus is a typical sonic deity, a god of the underworld. He's a god, I said, of irrationality. His followers used to have a Eucharist, a meal in his honor. To try and identify with the deity, they would eat a bull, or actually a calf, a bull calf, which they would tear apart like the Maenads in a rage, in a drunken rage. Alcohol was used to try and assimilate the irrationality of the deity, to be one with the deity. And the idea of having a drink or a meal to be associated with the deity is a very old one, and Christians to this day still do it, albeit in a very symbolic way. But if you consider that in the Roman Catholic Church, the transubstantiation of the body and blood of Christ is believed to be actual, not symbolic, they're not very far away from the actual consumption of real blood and real flesh, if that makes sense. So let me leave it there. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to go into more detail. So very quickly, I'm going to show you some very ancient images of Orpheus. This is from the 5th century BCE, and you can see Orpheus playing his lyre there on the left, and he's talking.
Before you
Yeah.
continue, can you hide that little button? See that on the top where it says stop sharing? Hide it.
There we go.
All right.
Perfect.
Continue.
Perfect. He's talking to the Thracians here, playing them music. And here's another scene from the British Museum of him playing his lyre to the Thracians. Now, I'm not going to waste too much time on this, but you can also get ceramics showing just his head in the sand prophesying, because his head was chopped off by the Maenads of Dionysus. Okay, so that's an early depiction of Orpheus. And this is 500, well, it's 900 years before Nicaea, and it's a good 600 years before Christianity really took off. And here we have a very ancient 6th century depiction of Moscophorus, the calf bearer. It comes from Athens, from the Acropolis, and we even know the name of the, I think his name was Rhodus, the name of the man who had it commissioned. It shows a follower of Athena Pantocrator, Parthenos, Athena Parthenos, bringing an animal for slaughter. But that idea, as I mentioned, was taken up with the Hermes Creophorus, which means ram bearer. And here we have a very early 6th century bronze figure from the Peloponnesian region, showing a very primitive depiction of Hermes with his helmet, and he's carrying a ram. And then this is a few years later, another one, and you can see he's got his winged sandals, because he's able to travel up and down, and the ram could also be seen as a symbol of the soul of a dead person who's going to be taken from this world to the next. And then a more recent one, there's the 5th century polychrome terracotta cult image, which comes from Boeotia. You can see that he's got the little lamb under his left arm there. And here we have one that comes from Italy. Don't forget the early Greeks colonized parts of Italy before and during the Etruscan period. And this little terracotta figure shows Hermes as a clean-shaven youth with curly hair holding a rather large ram on his shoulders. And here we have a Roman copy of the famous Creophorus of Calamus. Now, that unfortunately, that work doesn't exist anymore, but we know what it looked like from this Roman copy. So the original would have been made about the 5th century BCE. And you can see it shows a smooth, clean-shaven Hermes with curly hair holding the ram above his shoulders. It's a very popular image, and it lasts for centuries. And then we have Jesus portrayed as the Psychopompus, if you like, but also as a good shepherd holding a lamb above his shoulders. Symbolism is the same, the iconography is the same. The meaning may be slightly different, of course, because the way it's interpreted depends on one's religion. But he's dressed like a Hermes. He's clean shaven, curly hair. He has a bag around his shoulders, which is identical to the one that Hermes is portrayed with. And remember that Hermes continues to be portrayed even during the early Christian era, because there are other polytheists who still use that imagery. So it's not like there's a clear cut and suddenly they all stop portraying Hermes and Orpheus. It's a continuum. And here we have an early painting of Jesus as the Good Shepherd. And what's interesting here is that they have not only shown him as a Hermes, but they've brought in aspects of Orpheus, because Orpheus tamed the animals. So the animals are around this figure who, through his power, is able to create peace and harmony in the world. Here we have one from the early 3rd century, from the Catacomb of St. Calixtus. And you can see that Jesus has around his shoulders that little bag. He has animals around him, which ties him in indirectly with Orpheus, and he has the lamb on his shoulders. And another one a little bit later in the 3rd century, almost identical. But here they've done a little bit more in terms of the animals. You've also got birds who are obeying him and being calmed by his presence. Then we have this 4th century mosaic. This is a floor mosaic. It's quite big. Well, actually, this section is quite small, but the mosaic is huge. It's divided up into little sections. And what is fascinating is that look at what Jesus holds in his right hand. He holds a flute, one of those pipe flutes that you would expect Pan to use. And the suggestion is that he is here referring to Orpheus as well. So he's a kind of a Jesus / Orpheus / Hermes icon. But this is in the service of Christianity specifically. At the same time as this is going on, here is a floor mosaic, a Roman floor mosaic for Roman polytheists. And you can see that Orpheus is shown with his lyre, with all the animals around him, the birds and the animals. Very similar symbol. And then we jump over to the Catacomb of Domitilla in Rome, and Jesus is portrayed as Orpheus holding the panpipes in his hand and calming the animals. Because it raises a very interesting question. Why was Jesus being portrayed as Orpheus? And the feeling is that perhaps the authorities at that time didn't know quite what to do with Jesus, because maybe some of them felt it was sinful to try and depict him. A little bit like maybe a modern Muslim saying it's not, you shouldn't try to depict things in the natural world. And maybe they didn't want to get into trouble. We don't know, because some catacombs did make attempts at portraying a young man who looked like Apollo. And then by the late 3rd and early 4th century, as we've seen in previous talks that we've done, he suddenly gets a beard and starts to look more mature and starts to look like a little Roman senator, a little magistrate, somebody of authority. And then later, he starts looking like Zeus with the full curly beard and maturity. And this is the last slide I'll show you. This was found a few years ago, I think 2015, in excavations at St. Calixtus in Rome. They found an intact tomb in very bad state of repair. And on the ceiling, you can see Jesus portrayed as Orpheus. And what you can't see in this image, unfortunately, are all the animals around him. There's references to Jonah and the big fish. And I think there's a scene of Peter fishing, because he's obviously fishing for souls. And the animal theme is also incorporated.
So, my final question before we close is based on the iconography and the similarities to Christian iconography that you've just shown.
Mm.
So we're not just seeing Jesus imitating so-called pagan dying rising gods, but even the art depicting Jesus is also imitating art depicting other dying rising gods.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
Other gods too.
Yeah. Rome especially, and Alexandria to a lesser extent, were melting pots of ideas. I mean, if you went back to the 1st century, the height of the Hellenistic period, you would be amongst worshippers of Serapis, Isis, Mithras, Sol Invictus, Jesus. There's a mishmash and they're all competing, if you like, for hegemony in that culture. And the Romans were very open about your private beliefs. That's why these stories of uncontrollable hatred towards Christians and destruction of Christians for 4 centuries doesn't ring true for me. I'm not saying there wasn't persecution. There certainly was. There was also persecution of the worshippers of Bacchus for a while. But we find, if you read between the lines, a lot of times these persecutions are based on political issues, not religious issues. So you have to be very careful. And I think what's happened here is history has been reinvented and retold in a way that suits the what's the word I'm looking for? Suits the philosophy of the surviving religion. I mean, it's after the 5th century, you weren't allowed to engage in any of these other religions in the Roman world because it was a total Christian system, and other religions went underground for a while and eventually were ferreted out, and they eventually disappeared. So if we're going to believe that Christians were persecuted for 400 years solid and then suddenly won the day and then everybody else went underground, I think it's just a bit too simplistic. I think, for example, I'm giving you one example. If you took the average Roman, say at the time of Augustus Caesar, I would believe that your plebeian class of person was probably very nationalistic, and they were probably very conservative. And they probably looked down their noses at people who had gods that came from Egypt or abroad. They may have seen them as not being loyal Romans. And maybe Christianity, gave them the hump. But certainly amongst your upper class people, the people with money and privilege and power, there was a huge interest in trying out other flavors, if I can say that. People wanted to become Jews, or they wanted to try Serapis, or they wanted to try Isis. There was a big interest in that. And so much so that under the last triumvirate, which included Octavian, then Augustus Caesar, they built an Elysium in honor of Isis, a massive one. And they wouldn't have done that if it wasn't in their political interest to do that. They did that because they wanted to get the opinion of the masses on their side. The fact that they spent all that money building these temples to foreign deities shows you that it wasn't completely frowned upon. Certainly not with the upper classes. So I think the jury's out there,
So I just want to tell everybody real quick that I'll have the links to Nicholas Allen's books in the description below, like the Jesus Fallacy, his book on ancient Christian forgery, and others will be in the description below and in the pinned comment. With that being said, thank you for joining me today, Nicholas.
It's an absolute pleasure, Jacob.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.